The following program is a PBS Wisconsin original production.
For many, the idea of Black communities in the Midwest is traced to the Great Migration. However, the Black population was here well before then, just in smaller numbers. How did these communities get started, and how did they pave the way for the people that came after? Let's find out why race matters regarding the history of Black Midwesterners. While we often think of the South as the heart of Black history in America, the Midwest has its own powerful story to tell. By 1850, Wisconsin's Black population was small but growing, with about 635 Black residents statewide, despite systemic racism and discriminatory laws. During the Great Migration in the early 20th century, Wisconsin saw a significant increase in its Black population as families moved north to escape violence in the South and find industrial jobs. Milwaukee, for example, saw its Black population grow from fewer than 1,000 people in 1910 to over 21,000 by 1950. In this episode of Why Race Matters, we're sitting down with Dr. Christy Clark Pujara from UW-Madison's Department of African American Studies. We'll dive into the forgotten history of Black Midwesterners and discuss how Black identity in the Midwest has been shaped by resilience, resistance, and the ongoing search for community. How are you doing tonight, Dr. Clark Pujara?
I'm doing pretty good, and yourself?
I'm doing great, and I appreciate you taking the time out to join us on Why Race Matters to talk about your work. So I'm seriously looking forward to this free history lesson.
Well, thanks for having me.
You're going to offer us. So can you tell us a little bit about your work in terms of being a Black historian that has focused some of your work on the Midwest, but also how you got into that area of study?
Yeah, so I am a unlikely academic and historian. If you had told me in high school this is what I've been doing, I would have laughed in your face. You know, I wanted to go into, I actually started off pre-med, took some classes in college from history professors and got really intrigued because suddenly it wasn't about memorizing names and dates. It was about why our world looked the way it did, and I found that really intriguing. And long story short, I was taking history classes out of pure interest, and my advisor asked me, why are you taking all these history classes? I said, because I like them. He said, do you ever think about doing what you like? I had not. I was a first generation college student, and you know, I was a good student, and so it was, you know, go into business, law, or become a medical doctor. I didn't know what a historian did.
Right.
What you could do with a history major, it didn't make sense to me. My advisor told me to go talk to my history professors, and so I did that. And I found out, oh, these people, like, they write books, they do primary research, they're the citation. And I found that really intriguing and decided to go to graduate school instead of medical school. I'm from Omaha, Nebraska. My mother's family was there before it became a state. I went to college at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. I went to graduate school at the University of Iowa in Iowa City, and I have lived here since 2009. So I am a Midwesterner.
Thank you for that retelling of your journey to how you got to this place of not only having the lived experience of a Black person in the Midwest, but also having the scholastic expertise to be able to then give people a retelling of, okay, historically what has transpired that has brought us to the present day condition around Blackness within not just our state, but our region. So can you tell us a little bit more about the historical component there? Because I think at a surface level, those of us who have no background in history are like, oh yeah, the Great Migration. A lot of us came up from the South, settled in places like Chicago, Milwaukee, and that's how Black people came to a state like Wisconsin. But is that the full story? As well as, I know I glossed over the Great Migration. So anything you want to add to really help those who may not have any idea of what we're talking about, what that means as well?
The history of people of African descent, of Black people in the Midwest, that goes back to about 1725. That's one of the first historical records you have of people of African descent being in the place that becomes Wisconsin, and they were here with the French colonists. A lot of Wisconsinites seem to either be pretty light on their history or kind of forget the history of French colonization, which is funny because, you know, we have places like Prairie du Chien and Clare, Wisconsin, right? Like those are holdovers of French colonization. And so you have a history that in the region goes back to the 15th century, and in what becomes the state goes back to the 18th century. So sometimes when I tell people that I'm studying Black people in early Wisconsin, they'll just look at me because they assume that they weren't there, and they were.
And so earlier than what we assumed, there was a Black presence.
Yes.
And how did that change over time? And what were those experiences like of those who were here earlier than when the rest may have come during the Great Migration?
It was very varied, right? Because the Midwest, as it was coming into being, and the Midwest gets that name because of the Northwest Ordinance, which most people learned about in school, right? That at the dawn of the American Revolution, you know, you have the Northwest Ordinance that then becomes the Midwest, right? And then that expands later. But the Northwest Ordinance states, and it's been a minute since I've quizzed myself on this, are Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, right, are carved out of the Northwest Territories. And the Northwest Territories were part of the concessions that the British give the Americans at the end of the American Revolution. So America is born an empire, right, has territories. At the same time, it becomes a republic, right? And so those 5 states are carved out of those territories. But those territories already had a history of colonization. And that history of colonization was Spanish and then French and then British and then American, right? And so you're talking about successive colonial experiences. So if we just think about Wisconsin in the 1720s, you have people that are, you have Black people that are both free and enslaved people are usually with the French fur traders or military people, right? So you might be accompanying a captain, and you might be in charge of reloading his rifle. Or you might be with a fur trapper, and that's what you are doing. You are catching beavers, right? You are running down foxes, and then you are stretching those animal skins that are then being transported back to the East Coast, that then go across the Atlantic and are sold, right? And so it's really varied. You may be building a fort, the very first fort in a place, right? Because that's a colonial exercise. That's how you claim a space and try to get control over that space. So you might literally be building the first roads and homes and buildings. And so there wasn't a experience, there was a variety of experiences. So often when people think about American slavery, they just immediately go to like cotton or tobacco. But what made enslaved people so incredibly valuable was the fact that they were people. So they could be a translator. They could be a master carpenter. They could be a fur trapper. They could mine lead. They could build roads. They could keep notes, all kinds of things. And so you have a really varied experience. What makes the Midwest unique is that the experience of enslavement was sparse and really varied. You don't have plantation slavery.
Got it.
Right, which is what people often think about when they think about American slavery. That was one type, but that wasn't the only kind, right? And so that you have people who were doing agricultural work in the Midwest, but you have people who never did any agricultural work.
So for the examples that you gave of individuals who might be, you said supporting a captain and loading a rifle or fur trade involvement professionals, were those folks enslaved in doing that work? Were they free? Like, what was their status and proximity to slavery as in the way that we understand
During
it?
the French period, we would understand them as chattel. The French had something called the Code Niort, so they had a very centralized colonial government where there was the law and procedures of what enslavement was supposed to look like. Now, whether that was actually happening in the hinterlands
Is a different
was one
thing.
thing, but there was a code.
Okay.
When the British come in, it gets diffuse because the British the British system was more decentralized. And when the American comes in, it gets even more diffuse. And it gets super confusing
Right.
because the Americans in the Northwest Ordinance say that slavery is prohibited in the Northwest Territories. So that's what the law says.
Right.
Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance says that slavery is prohibited in the Northwest Territories. But there is law, and then there is the practice. When we think about our first territorial governor, Henry Dodge, where's he from? He's from Missouri. He's born into a slaveholding family. Who does he bring with him? Toby, Tom, Lear, Jim, and Joe, who he illegally holds in bondage for nearly a dozen years, has them mining lead year-round. And then you have to think about the military forts, because again, this is how you exert your power as a colonial force. So if you want to map out areas of slavery in the Midwest, just look for the first forts, right? And in Wisconsin, you think of places like Prairie du Chien, where Fort Crawford was, right? It had previously been a place where the French military fort was, becomes an American fort. And military officers were actually given an allowance to hire or buy slaves. They could have servants or they could have slaves.
Even though slavery was illegal?
Yes, but military officers, one of the perks of being a military officer was an allowance to pay you back for the use of your own enslaved person, excuse me, I'm trying to make sure my language stays on point. We say enslaved people to recognize their humanity. Nobody is a slave. People are made to, their labor is stolen. So we refer to them as enslaved people. So I'm going to turn it on you just a little bit. Who was the president of the Confederacy? Do you remember?
Ooh, I don't.
Jefferson Davis.
Okay.
Right? Where's Jefferson Davis's first military posting before he becomes Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy? As an officer.
In the South, I'm assuming?
In Prairie du Chien, where he brings
Wisconsin.
enslaved people with him. And he is reimbursed for their use.
So the practice of slavery was clearly a thing, even
was a
though
thing.
legally, like you're saying, it wasn't. And so is that where some of the thinking around the idea of slavery not existing?
Yeah, so there's this
area comes
idea that
from?
slavery doesn't exist in the Midwest. Now, I don't want people to get the wrong impression. Slavery was sparse and irregular,
Okay.
especially in the American Midwest. It is sparse and it was irregular, but it persisted well into the 1840s. And it's because of the cultural comfort with slavery. Who is coming to these places?
Right.
People who grew up in a slave-holding American republic.
Right.
America is born a slave-holding republic.
And it's not
Most
as-
of the presidents are slave holders. This isn't something notorious or strange to anyone.
It's not as though when people move, they're like, okay, we're done with that. We're going to not do the thing that we've been steeped in
It's doing, right?
until this point of my life. It's just
Absolutely.
continuing, yeah.
So the practice of slavery in the Midwest, in the American colonial period, rests on community consent, not legal consent, but cultural and community consent.
Wow. So there, like you're saying, there's those loopholes where on military bases will allow certain things, but if you are still engaging in certain practices outside of the loopholes, then you can be challenged if people know to challenge and...
Or they want to challenge you. Because when does Henry Dodge, our first territorial governor, finally emancipate these people who weren't supposed to be held in bondage in the first place? When it becomes a political liability, because statehood is becoming imminent and those votes are coming up. So, okay, now I need to do this. And he actually writes emancipation papers. You can go to UW Platteville, to the Wisconsin room, ask for the papers of Henry Dodge, and see a manumission document that was brought to the county as if it were normal practice, right? In which he says that he had promised to free them at a convenient time. Well, they're never was supposed to be held in bondage. You weren't at a fort. You held them with community consent. Right. You're emancipating people who weren't supposed to be held in bondage in the first place, but your community allowed it. And your neighbors allowed it.
It's safe to assume there was no pushback or no response to him carrying out this practice that could be seen as like noble and the right thing to do, even though he shouldn't have been doing it in the first place.
Well, there were people who were critical of it,
okay,
but he continued to do it. They made him very rich, right? He was mining lead year round with these 5 people, right? And that's what allows him to buy plots of land and become a prospector and have a successful mine and become Henry Dodge. And now my students just know Henry Dodge as the, hardy founding father who the state park is named after, that the pavilion is named after, that the library is named after. And they've never heard of Toby, Tom, Lear, Jim, and Joe.
Wow. And so up until this point, you've been telling us about the history of Black people in the state of Wisconsin and where the topic of slavery presented itself within the law, within practice, but we haven't yet gotten to the point of these urban centers where now, I'm thinking of present day Wisconsin, where we are more likely to be living. And so how do we get from the place of where you've introduced us to now we have these urban centers that are considered more of the predominantly, not even predominantly, but where Black people are more likely to live within the state of Wisconsin?
Yeah, so before the Civil War, some 63,000 Black people, both free and freedom-seeking, and when I say freedom-seeking, I mean they stole themselves and felt very satisfied in that, right? They had stole themselves from bondage, right? You have some 63,000 free and freedom-seeking Black people in what becomes the Northwest Territory states. And that number is actually really significant, because in order to become a state in that period, you had to have 60,000 non-Indigenous people.
Wow.
So that means there was more than a state's worth of Black people coming to the Midwest before the Civil War. And the reason why they were coming was a reason why a lot of white Americans and Western European immigrants and then Eastern European immigrants were coming for opportunity, in particular, the opportunity to own land, because the Northwest Ordinance did not have a racial qualifier for land ownership. The Black population was rural. It becomes urban. It becomes urban after the Civil War and during the Great Migration. The migration is after the Civil War, coming into the 20th century, when you have over 1 billion Black people migrating out of the South into primarily cities in the North. And so when we're thinking about race, it's because race shaped the Midwest. The Midwest is overwhelmingly white on purpose, right? There were policies and laws that encouraged the migration of white people to the Midwest and discouraged the migration of Black people to the Midwest. And all you have to do is look at territorial laws and statutes to see that. To become an incorporated town during the territorial period in Wisconsin, the only people who got counted were white men, right? And so you have a situation in which whiteness is cultivated in the Midwest very intentionally.
And does that relate to you mentioning that the original Black people that were in the state were more likely to be present in rural spaces? Were those territorial laws also influential in terms of how we've seen that shift over time? In terms of our ability to own land and maintain our presence in those rural settings?
Yeah, because you see Black rural land ownership in places like Pleasant Ridge, Town of Forest. And some of that loss of land happened organically. Kids didn't want to stay. They went to World War I, were like, I'm not going to go back to that small town. But it also becomes an increasingly hostile space for Black people to be, right? And after the Civil War, you also get the rise of sundown towns, where it becomes a safety thing. and you see the Black population leaving rural areas all over the Midwest and concentrating in cities.
Which is interesting because those cities then also get the recognition, or unfairly, right, of being unsafe. When, based on your description, they attracted the communities they did because of the feeling of safety that wasn't present in those non-urban settings. So that's just, to me, like counterintuitive, like you're calling these cities dangerous, but because of who lives there and the numbers in which they live there, but how these people come to be here, because that's where they felt
And those
safe.
cities get designated as dangerous in the post-industrial age when the jobs dry up. And any area where there is a lack of economic hope becomes dangerous. I don't care who's there,
Excellent point.
right?
Right. 'Cause people have to do what they have to do then
Yes.
to sustain
right?
themselves.
And so,
Yeah.
you know, they start getting those reputations as dangerous in that post-industrial economic decline where manufacturing, middle-class, stable jobs disappear. But not looking at that really kind of longer picture. And the Black population in the Midwest, especially before the Civil War, was really small, right? They're very small numbers. When I'm talking about Black people in Wisconsin, you know, in the 1830s, I'm talking about hundreds, and then in the 1840s, thousands. But what's really curious about that is you would have thought there were a whole lot more of them. When you read the territorial debates and how much time was spent discussing whether or not Black men would have access to the ballot box, you would have thought that they were, you know,
here in
creating some kind of
droves.
political block. It's like if all the Black people had voted 3 times, they still wouldn't have
wouldn't
created
have.
a political block. The discussion was about who was a worthy citizen and who was welcome in that place and who was not. Because the Midwest, I think, then and now, is oppressive and progressive at the same time. It's not either or, it's and. So in the 1840s, a freedom-seeking Black person could expect to find help on the Underground Railroad in Wisconsin. But a free Black man that traced their ancestry back to the colonial period couldn't vote.
And what you're describing also seems to reflect the tone that I've heard from others when comparing the experience of racism in the Midwest compared to the South, for example, where it might be more explicit in your face. And here it's described as more passive aggressive, because what you just told us about
Absolutely
is
passive
passive aggressive.
racism. And this is just my personal
Yeah.
experience and point of view. I much prefer the in-your-face racism that often happens in places like the South because you know where you stand. It is exhausting dealing with passive aggressive racism. It's a minefield. It is emotionally and mentally exhausting. And I say that as a Midwesterner.
Right. Like, this is home for you. This is what you've known your entire life.
Yeah, I just rather someone tell me to my face,
Right. Right.
I don't like you. I don't want you here.
Right.
Versus the experiences I've had, and they go back to childhood. I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, and so most of my friends were white, and they told me what their parents said. But that's not what happened when you saw my parents at the park or the grocery store.
Right.
Right? And so I grew up with that duality, that understanding, that smiling, how was the weather, Midwest nice in your face, wasn't genuine. Sometimes I'll have someone say something to me like, why are you always talking about race? Why are you always talking about white and Black? Because the founders of my country and the founders of the state that I live in were obsessed with it.
Right.
And that's not my opinion. Just read the suffrage article in the 1848 Wisconsin Constitution.
Right.
What does it say? The first condition is, after you do the age, maleness, then what becomes next? White.
Right.
And you didn't even need to be a citizen. You just needed to be white, right? If you were a white person who was not yet a citizen of the United States, All you had to do to vote in the state of Wisconsin after 1848 is declare an intention, to publicly declare an intention to become a citizen of the state, have lived here for the designated amount of time, I think it was 6 months or a year, be 21 years or older, and male, right? And so they made it about race. Right. And we are being disingenuous in talking about what our society looks like now when we try to act like that wasn't a thing.
Absolutely.
Right? This is not my language. This is not my lexicon. This is the language of colonizers. They were talking about whiteness and blackness. They were debating black male suffrage and coming up with all of the reasons why black men who trace their heritage back to the colonial period couldn't vote, but others could.
Right.
And so I'm just being true to the history. And I think it's really important for people to really understand that and look at these primary documents and not just assume that it's myself, inserting this. No. I'm talking about what was there, and they were obsessed with race, not me.
Right. I'm just, like you said, honoring the language and the context that was created that we all have to navigate within. So initially you mentioned when you speak to your students, talk to your classes about why history matters. So for the time period we've been in conversation, you've been laying the foundation for the history of Black people in the Midwest. For some who are like, I'm not really into history like that, why does that matter today in terms of our understanding of the Black experience in the Midwest and in Wisconsin and what it can tell us about our future?
It tells us why our neighborhoods look the way they do. What is the wealthiest neighborhood in Madison? Nakoma. And Nakoma was a restricted neighborhood. Jews and people of Ethiopian race, that is a direct quote, were not allowed to buy plots there. And then people inherit homes.
That's very specific.
And home ownership is how Americans build wealth. If you want to understand wealth gaps among African Americans and white Americans, you need to understand history. If you want to understand why Milwaukee looks the way it does, you need to understand redlining and housing discrimination. This doesn't just come out of nowhere.
Right. History
explains our present. Right. It tells us why our cities look and function the way they do. Who's had access to opportunity and who has not.
And what would you say has been the contributions culturally, socially, economically of having a Black presence in our state?
Black people's insistence on having an opportunity here of fighting for their rights as full American citizens here. The Wisconsin Historical Society has digitized its petition records. Petitions are absolutely fabulous because petitions are how you get the voices of people who could not participate in the formal politics, right? Everyone had the right to petition. Women have the right to petition. Native Americans have the right to petition. The African Americans, Asian Americans have the right to petition. And they tell you what they're fighting for in their communities, right? And so if you want to understand where that love of justice, of liberty comes from, it's from those communities, right? And the Midwest is where America was figuring out who it was. That's why there's so much myth around it and romanticization of the Midwest and, those kind of like hokey commercials that talk about the Midwest, that if you're from the Midwest, you kind of cringe like, there's cities in the Midwest. Yes, there's farms in the Midwest and there's, small towns in the Midwest. All of that is being sussed out in this period. And Black people refuse to simply be acted upon. They refuse to have their humanity stripped from them. They refused to have their claims of citizenship taken from them. They contested. They made it arguable, right? And so if you want to understand where this kind of grassroots, everybody has a right to be heard.
That comes from Black people.
Right? That comes from people who were pushed to the margins. And sometimes that was Western European immigrants. And sometimes it was women. And sometimes it was Asian Americans. And sometimes it was African Americans. If you don't study the people who were pushed to the margins, you don't understand the places that you're in. Because they weren't simply acted upon.
Right.
They demanded a space.
So it sounds like we would all benefit from maybe not fully becoming historians, but at least learning more about the history that isn't always taught to us.
Absolutely. And I always tell my students, if you pick up a history book and a good chunk of it isn't footnotes, be suspect. Because a good historian is going to tell you why they think what they think. Right? I'm going to make an argument about community consent overriding the prohibition of slavery in Article 6. Well, I should be able to tell you what document I looked at and what archive you can find it in, the folder name, right? That it is a discipline that rests upon evidence, right? And good historians are going to tell you why they think what they think and tell you where you can find that.
Well, that's an excellent point. And we would all benefit from, like you're saying, doing our homework a little bit and reading up on our history so
Absolutely.
we can understand our present and also help contribute towards our future. Thank you so much, Dr. Clark-Bajara.
You're very welcome.
The experiences of Black people in the Midwest before the Great Migration reveal a history of resilience and determination in the face of systemic barriers. Their contributions to the region's culture, economy, and social fabric laid a foundation for future generations. Understanding their legacy helps us honor their struggles and achievements while working toward a more equitable future. Watch additional episodes and content at whyracematters.org.
Funding for Why Race Matters is provided by Park Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, UW Health, donors to the Focus Fund for Wisconsin Programs, and friends of PBS Wisconsin.